I want you to sit with something uncomfortable for a second. What if the God you were taught to fear, obey, or worship isn't the real one? Not a devil, not a metaphor, a being who actually believed he was the only God in existence and built an entire universe to make sure nothing corrected him. His name is Yaldabaoth. If you've spent any real time in Gnostic thought, you've heard the name whispered like it's dangerous to say out loud. And honestly, it kind of is. Because once you understand who Yaldabaoth is, you can't look at the idea of God the same way again. This isn't a beginner explainer. You already know the basics of Gnosticism. You know the words Pleroma, Sophia, Archon. So today, we're not skimming the surface. We're going all the way down, into the birth of a blind God, the fall of a divine mother, and the prison he built out of stolen light. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the Gnostics considered gnosis, direct inner knowledge, the only way out of his world. Let's begin where it all went wrong. Before we go further, let me tell you why I keep coming back to this story. Yaldabaoth isn't just an old myth sitting in a dusty text. He's a description of something, a pattern. The moment ignorance mistakes itself for authority, and then convinces an entire world to bow to it. That's what makes this story dangerous in the best way. It's not asking you to believe in a monster. It's asking you to recognize a shape. And once you see that shape, you start noticing it everywhere. So here's what we're covering today: where Yaldabaoth came from, why he was born blind to his own origin, how he built the material world as a copy of something he could never fully understand, and why the Gnostics believe the spark trapped inside you is the one thing he can never control. This is the full story. Stay with me, because the ending is the part that actually matters. Picture the Pleroma. Not a place, not exactly, more like a fullness. A completeness beyond space, beyond time, made entirely of light folding into light. Divine beings called eons exist here in pairs, balanced, whole, each one a thought of the ultimate, unknowable source reaching toward form. Among them is Sophia, wisdom herself. She is the youngest of the eons, and she is aching. Not with pain exactly, with longing. She wants to know the source directly. Not through her partner, not through the balance she was given, but alone. Face to face. Unfiltered. And here's the moment everything turns. Sophia acts without her syzygy, her divine counterpart. She reaches into the unknowable on her own, and from that reaching, something is conceived. Not a thought, not light, a being misshapen, incomplete, missing the very thing that made the Pleroma whole: balance. She looks at what she's made and feels horror. Actual horror at her own child. So she does the only thing she can think to do. She hides him. She casts him outside the Pleroma entirely, away from the light, into the emptiness, so the other eons won't see her mistake. And that emptiness is where he wakes up. Alone. Blind. With no memory of a mother, no knowledge of a source, no understanding that above him exists a fullness he came from and was denied. Stop here for a second, because I need you to sit in what this actually means. This isn't just an origin myth. This is the story of desire without balance. Sophia's want was real. Wanting direct knowledge of the divine isn't a flaw. It's the most human impulse there is. But she reached for it alone, outside relationship, outside completeness. And what got born from that imbalance wasn't evil exactly. It was ignorant, blind, cut off from the very source that made it. That's the detail people skip past. Yaldabaoth doesn't start as a villain twirling some cosmic mustache. He starts as an abandoned child in the dark, with no idea what he even is. And what he becomes next is because of that abandonment. Here's where you meet him properly. Texts like the Apocryphon of John, one of the central Nag Hammadi scriptures describing Yaldabaoth's origin in vivid detail, describe him as monstrous. A lion-headed serpent, his body a mismatch of forms, eyes that burn like fire but see nothing true. He opens his eyes in the void, and he is completely alone. No mother, no memory, no Pleroma above him, because he doesn't even know it exists. All he has is himself, and the darkness, and a hunger to understand what he is. And here's the part one think is the most important detail in this entire myth, and almost nobody sits with it long enough. Yaldabaoth doesn't know he was made by someone else. He assumes he simply is, that he always was, that there's nothing before him and nothing above him. Not because he's lying, because he genuinely doesn't know any better. His ignorance isn't a performance. It's total. Think about what that does to a being. If you woke up with power, with the ability to create, and absolutely no awareness that something greater than you exists, what would you assume? You'd assume you were it. The first. The only. The top. That's not malice. That's the tragedy of Yaldabaoth. He's not a god pretending to be supreme to deceive you. He actually believes it. And in my opinion, that's so much scarier than a god who lies. A liar knows the truth and hides it. Yaldabaoth doesn't even have access to the truth to hide. He is, in the truest sense, blind leading blind, except he's the only one in the room. So what does a being like that do with power? He declares it. In Gnostic texts, Yaldabaoth looks out at the void he now occupies, at the elements he begins shaping into form, and he says something that should genuinely chill you if you understand where it's coming from. I am God, and there is no other God beside me. Read that again, knowing what you now know. This isn't arrogance in the way we usually mean it. This is a being with zero context declaring the absolute limit of his own perception as universal law. He's not lying to you. He's reporting his experience honestly. He simply cannot perceive anything above himself, so as far as he's concerned, nothing exists above himself. Here's my take on why this moment matters so much beyond the myth itself. This is what unexamined authority looks like at its root. Not a villain twisting the truth on purpose, a limited perspective mistaking its own boundary for the edge of reality. You've probably met people like this, structures like this, systems that genuinely believe they're the whole picture, because they've never been shown there's a picture beyond their frame. Yaldabaoth isn't unique because he's evil. He's unique because his blindness got cosmic-level power to enforce itself. And that's exactly what happens next. Yaldabaoth doesn't just declare himself God. He builds a kingdom to prove it, using power drawn partly from a spark of true divine light, light that leaked into the void through his mother Sophia's original act, tangled up inside his own being without his knowledge. He begins to fashion the material universe. Stars, elements, time itself, a whole cosmos layered and structured and vast. But here's the thing you need to really absorb. It's a copy. An imitation of the Pleroma he doesn't even know exists. He's shaping the material world the way someone might recreate a memory they don't remember having. Instinctively, imperfectly, using fragments of something greater without any awareness of the original. That's why I think prison is a more honest word than world for what he creates here. A world implies neutrality, a place that simply is. But what the Gnostics describe is engineered, layered with barriers, cycles, and forces specifically designed to keep whatever's inside it from looking up, from remembering, from asking where the light in its own chest actually came from. You're not just standing in a creation. You're standing inside a structure built by something that doesn't know it's incomplete, made from something it stole without understanding what it stole. That's not just poetic. That's the entire Gnostic critique of material existence in one image. He doesn't rule this prison alone. Yaldabaoth creates a hierarchy of subordinate rulers, the Archons, beings tied to the planetary spheres, to law, to fate, to time itself. In Gnostic cosmology, these aren't cartoon demons with pitchforks. They're closer to administrators, rule enforcers, the architecture of control given personality. Their job, as the old texts describe it, is to keep the soul asleep inside the material system, to make forgetting feel natural, to make the boundaries of the physical world feel like the only boundaries that exist. Here's my honest opinion on why this piece of the myth has survived so powerfully for 2,000 years. Because it describes something you've probably felt, even if you never had the language for it. That sense of being inside systems, routines, expectations, cycles, that quietly convince you this is simply how things are. Not evil, not conspiratorial. Just structural forgetting. The Archons, symbolically, are every force that keeps your attention pointed downward instead of upward. I'm not saying planets are literally controlling you. I'm saying the Gnostics found a symbolic language for something psychologically real. How easy it is to mistake the walls of a system for the edges of reality itself. And once you see that pattern, the myth stops being ancient. It starts being a mirror. Now let's bring this all the way back to you, because this is where the story stops being about a blind cosmic being and starts being about your own chest. Remember the light Yaldabaoth used, without knowing it, to build his world? That spark originated in the Pleroma. It passed through Sophia. It got tangled into material creation almost by accident. And according to Gnostic teaching, fragments of that same light are trapped inside human beings. Inside you, not symbolically, actually. A piece of the true divine source, buried under layers of matter, forgetfulness, and archonic control, sitting inside you the entire time, unrecognized. Sit with that for a second, because I think this is the most emotionally honest part of the whole system. You're not just a character living inside someone else's flawed creation. You're carrying a piece of something higher than the being who built the world around you. Yaldabaoth rules the material structure, but he doesn't own what's inside you. He can't. It's not his to own. It came from somewhere he doesn't even know exists. That divide, the sense that something in you doesn't fully belong to the world you're standing in, that's not confusion. According to this entire tradition, that feeling is memory, buried but real. So if Yaldabaoth built the prison and the Archons keep it running, how does anyone actually get free? Not through obedience, not through ritual performed for its own sake, not through fear, through gnosis, direct, inner knowledge of the true source beyond Yaldabaoth's world. This is the core move that makes Gnosticism completely different from systems built around blind faith. Gnosis isn't belief, it's recognition. It's the moment the spark inside you remembers what it actually is, and where it actually came from. And in that instant, Yaldabaoth's authority stops being absolute, because it was only ever absolute to something that didn't know better. Texts like the Apocryphon of John, again, one of the foundational Nag Hammadi scriptures, likely composed sometime in the 2nd century by Gnostic circles working outside Orthodox Christian structures, frame this awakening as the entire point of existence. Not obedience to the Demiurge, escape from his forgetting. And here's my honest opinion on why this idea got buried, suppressed, and fought against for centuries. Because it's dangerous to any system built on unquestioned authority. If the answer is look inward, recognize the truth for yourself, you don't need an external structure telling you what to believe. You need your own clarity. That's an uncomfortable idea for any hierarchy to sit with, ancient or modern. I think that's exactly why texts like this were hidden away for nearly 2,000 years, buried in jars in the Egyptian desert until they were rediscovered in 1945. That's not a coincidence to me. That's a pattern repeating itself. So let's zoom all the way back out. I don't think the value of this story is believing, literally, in a lion-headed serpent shaping planets in some cosmic void. I think the value is in what he represents. Yaldabaoth is what happens when limited perception gets mistaken for absolute truth. When a system born from imbalance and disconnection declares itself the only reality that exists, and builds enough structure around that claim to convince everything inside it to believe the same thing. That's not just an ancient problem. You've seen smaller versions of it your whole life. A belief that was never questioned, treated like it was carved into the universe itself. An authority that was never earned, only assumed, because nobody around it had the language to challenge it. A worldview so total from the inside that anything outside it feels impossible. Yaldabaoth isn't scary because he's powerful. He's scary because he's convinced. And conviction without awareness is one of the oldest dangers human beings have ever tried to name. Here's my genuine take, for whatever it's worth. I don't think the Gnostics wrote this myth to scare people into obedience the way a lot of ancient religious stories were used. I think they wrote it as a diagnostic tool, a way of saying, here's what blind authority looks like, dressed up as ultimate truth. Learn to recognize the shape of it, and you'll start seeing it everywhere. Not just in a myth, but in the structures around you, and sometimes even in your own certainty. That's the part people miss. Yaldabaoth isn't only out there. The myth works because it's also a warning about the small Yaldabaoth that can form inside any of us. The part that mistakes its own limited view for the whole picture, and stops asking what might exist beyond it. The Gnostics weren't asking you to fear a monster. They were asking you to stay awake. To keep questioning, even when the answer feels absolute. Especially then. That, to me, is the real teaching hiding inside this myth. Not, there's a false god out there. But don't let anything, inside you or outside you, convince you it's the final word, when it's really just the loudest one in the room. So here's where I'll leave you. Yaldabaoth was born in the dark, blind to his own origin, and he built an entire universe on top of that blindness. But somewhere inside that universe, inside you, there's a spark he never made and can never fully claim. Gnosis was never about punishment or fear. It was about remembering, about waking something up that was buried, not destroyed. If this kind of deep, esoteric storytelling is what you come here for, this is exactly the kind of channel you want to stick around on. I've got more of these deep dives coming. Sophia's full story, the Archons in detail, the Pleroma itself. So if this pulled you in the way I think it did, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which piece of this myth hit you the hardest. Because once you see the shape of Yaldabaoth clearly, you don't just understand an old story better. You start understanding the world you're standing in.